5 On Finniston Farm, Chapter 17. Trapped. The 6 children stumbled down the tunnel, still hearing the far-off sound of the drills and fearing that at any moment the cellars would be discovered by Mr. Henning, who no doubt would be anxiously watching from above. They came to where they thought the burrow must be, that Dick had dug through, but instead there was nothing but a great mass of earth, some of it seeping into the tunnel. Julian gazed at it by the light of his torch, dismayed. "The burrow's fallen in," he said, his voice shaking. "What are we to do? We've no spades to dig ourselves out." "We can use our hands," said Dick, and began to scrabble at the fallen earth, sweeping it into the tunnel. But as he scrabbled, more and more earth fell into the widened burrow, and Julian stopped Dick at once. "No more of that, Dick. You might start an earthfall, and we'll all be buried alive. Oh gosh, this is awful. We'll have to go back up the passage and try to make the men hear us shouting. Blow. That means Mr. Henning will know what we're up to." "I don't believe the men will be there much longer," said Dick, looking at his watch. "They pick up at 5 and it's almost that now. My word, we've been ages. Mrs. Philpott will wonder where we all are." "The drilling has just stopped," said Anne. "I haven't got that awful noise inside my ears any longer." "In that case, it's certainly no good going back up the tunnel," said Julian. "They'd be gone before we got there. I say, you know, this is serious. I ought to have thought of this. Any idiot knows that ground entrances to passages should be strengthened if they're newly dug." "Well, we can always go back to the cellars and wait for the men to come tomorrow," said George, sounding more cheerful than she felt. "How do we know they'll be there tomorrow?" said Dick. "Henning may have paid them off today if he's disappointed in his hopes." "Don't be such a dismal Jimmy," said George, sensing that the twins were getting panicky. They certainly were worried, but more because they were certain that their mother would be scared to death if they didn't come home than for their own safety. Timmy had been standing patiently beside George, waiting to get out of the hole. At last, tired of waiting, he trotted away, but down the tunnel, not up. "Timmy, where are you going?" cried George, and shone her torch on him. He turned his head and looked at her, showing quite clearly by his manner that he was tired of standing about and intended to find out where the tunnel led. "Ju, look at Timmy. He wants us to go down the tunnel," cried George. "Why didn't we think of that?" "I don't know. I'm afraid I thought it would be a sort of blind alley," said Julian. "I fear it will too. Nobody knows where the chapel entrance to the tunnel is, do they, twins?" "No," they said, both together. "It's never been discovered, as far as we know." "Anyway, it's worth trying," said George, her voice sounding muffled as she went down the passage after the impatient Timmy. "I'm getting suffocated in here." The others followed, Snippet dancing along behind, thinking the whole thing was a huge joke. The tunnel, as the children had imagined, went downwards in more or less a straight line. It had fallen in slightly here and there, but by bending their heads and crouching low, they managed to get through. Finally, they came to a bad fall of earth from the roof, and had to crawl through on hands and knees. Anne didn't like that part at all. They came at last into a strange little place where the tunnel ended abruptly. It was like a stone vault, a little chamber about 5 feet high and 7 feet square. Julian looked up fearfully at its low roof. Was it of stone? If so, they were trapped. They would never be able to lift a heavy stone slab. No, not all the roof was made of stone. A piece in the middle, about 3 feet square, was made of strong, stout wood, which rested on ledges cut in the stone. "It looks like a trapdoor," said Julian, examining it by the light of his torch. "I wonder if we are just below the floor of the old chapel. Dick, if you and I and Harry all heave at the same time, we might be able to move this trapdoor." So they all heaved, George too, but although the door did lift a little up one corner, it simply could not be moved upwards. "I know why we can't move it," said Harry, red in the face with heaving. "There are sacks of grain and fertilizer and all kinds of stuff spread over the floor of the old chapel. They're heavy as lead. We'd never be able to move that trapdoor if 2 or 3 sacks are on it." "Gosh, I didn't think of that," said Julian, his heart sinking. "Didn't you know of this entrance into the tunnel, twins?" "Of course not," said Harry. "Nobody did. I can't think why it wasn't known, though, except, of course, that a storehouse like this has its floor always covered with sacks of something, and with the spillings out of those sacks, it may not have been cleaned out or swept for hundreds of years." "Well, what are we to do now?" demanded Dick. "We can't stay here in this stuffy little place." "Listen, I can hear something," said George suddenly. "Noises overhead." They listened intently, and through the tightly fitting oak trapdoor above them they heard a loud voice shouting, "Give us a hand, Bill, will you?" "It's Jamie. The men are working overtime this week," said Harry. "He's come to get something out of the chapel. Quick, let's all yell and hammer on the trapdoor with whatever we've got that'll make a noise." At once there was a perfect babble of sound from the little vault, yells, shouts, barks, and the hammering of sword handles and fists on the wooden slab overhead. Then the children ceased their hammering and fell silent, listening. They heard Jamie's voice, lifted in wonder. "Bill, what in the name of goodness was that? A rat fight, do you suppose?" "They heard us," said Julian, excited. "Come on, once again, and bark the place down, Timmy." Timmy was only too ready to oblige, for he was very tired of tunnels and dark, echoing places by now. He barked long and fiercely, frightening Snippet so much that the little poodle actually ran back up the tunnel. What with Tim's barking and everyone's yelling and the constant hammering, the noise was even louder than before, and Bill and Jamie listened in amazement. "Comes from over yonder," said Bill. "Summat's gone on there. Beats me what it is, though. If 'twere night time, I'd think it were ghosties having a game. Come on, we'll get over yonder." The place was so full of sacks that the 2 men had to clamber over the rows, disturbing the cat and her kittens. She had curled herself around them, scared of the unexpected noise. "This corner, Bill," said Jamie, standing on 2 layers of sacks. He put his hand to his mouth and bellowed like a bull. "Anyone about?" The 6 below answered frantically at the tops of their voices, Timmy barking too. "There's a dog barking down there," said Bill, scratching his head, puzzled, looking down at the sacks as if he thought there might be a dog in one of them. "A dog? There's folks as well," said Jamie, astounded. "Where are they? Can't be under these sacks." "Maybe they're in that little old store place we found one the other day in the floor," suggested Bill. "Remember? Under an old trap door it were, that were covered by a great slab of stone. You remember, man?" "Oh, aye," said Jamie, and then the clamour began again, for the children were now getting near despair. "Come on, Bill," said Jamie, hearing the note of urgency, though he couldn't make out a word from below. "Heave over these here sacks. We've got to get to the bottom of this." They heaved a dozen sacks away, and then at last the trapdoor was uncovered. The stone slab that had once hidden it had been taken up some years ago by the 2 men and now stood against the wall. They had not bothered to replace it, not guessing that the little old store place, as they had thought it, was really an entrance to a secret, long-forgotten passage. It was fortunate indeed for the children that only the old wooden trapdoor was between them and the men, for if the stone slab had been there too, no sound of their shouting would have been heard in the old chapel above. "Now for this here trapdoor," said Bill. He tapped on it with his great boot. "Who's down here?" he demanded, wondering what the answer would be. Us! Shrieked the twins, and the others joined in, with Timmy barking frantically again. Bless us all, them's the twins' voices I heard, said Jamie. How did they climb into that storeroom without moving these air sacks? With a great heave, the two men pulled up the heavy wooden slab and looked down in the greatest astonishment at the little crowd below. They couldn't believe their eyes. Timmy was the first out. He leapt upwards and landed beside the men, wagging his great tail and licking them lavishly. "Oh, thanks, Bill, thanks, Jamie," cried the twins as the two men pulled them up. "Gosh, I'm thankful you were working overtime and happened to come in here. Your ma's been hollering for you," said Bill disapprovingly. "And didn't you say you was going to help me with them poles?" "How did you get down there?" demanded Jamie, pulling up the others one by one. Julian was the last, and he handed up poor scared little Snippet, who really felt he had had quite enough adventures for one day. "Oh, it's too long a story to tell you just now," said Harry, "but thanks again most awfully, Bill and Jamie. Can you put that slab back? Don't tell anyone we were down there till we tell you how it happened, see? Now, we'll have to rush and tell Mother we're all right." And away they all went, longing for tea, tired out, full of thankfulness at their escape from the little stone room under the chapel floor. What would everyone say when they displayed the treasures they had brought back with them? Chapter 18. A Great Story to Tell. The twins tore down to the farmhouse and saw their mother still looking for them. They flung themselves on her, and she gave them a loving shake. "Where have you been? You're an hour late for tea, all of you. I've been so worried. Mr. Henning told me some story about you digging up on the hillside." "Mother, we're ravenous, so let's have tea and we'll tell you some great news," said the twins both together. "Mother, you will be astonished. Where's Dad and Great-Granddad too?" "They're still at the tea table. They were late too," said Mrs. Philpot. "They've been out looking for you all. Great-Granddad isn't very pleased. What in the world have you brought with you? Surely those are not swords." "Mother, let's have tea first, and we'll tell you everything," said the twins. "Must we wash? Oh, blow! All right, come on, everyone, let's wash, and we'll put our treasures down in the darkest corner so that Dad and Great-Granddad won't see them till we're ready to show them." Soon they were all sitting down at the tea table, glad to see a wonderful spread. Great slices of thickly buttered bread, homemade jam, homemade cheese, a fat ginger cake, a fruit cake, a dish of ripe plums, and even a home-cooked ham if anyone wanted something more substantial. Mr. Philpot and old Great-Granddad were still at the table drinking a last cup of tea. Mrs. Philpot had told them that the children had to wash, but would tell them all that had happened when they came to their tea. "Ho!" said Great-Granddad, frowning till his great bushy eyebrows almost covered his nose. "When I was a boy, I durstn't come in 1 minute late for my meals. You twins have worried your mother. That's bad." "We're awfully sorry, Great-Granddad," said the twins in unison, "but just wait till you hear our story. Julian, you tell it." And so, between great munches of bread and butter, ham sandwiches and slices of cake, the story was told, all the children joining in now and again. Great-Granddad already knew that Mr. Henning had been given permission to excavate, and that a cheque for £250 had been given to Mr. Philpot. He had flown into a terrible temper, and only when Mrs. Philpot had sobbed and said that she would give it back, though she could hardly bear to part with it, had Great-Granddad given in. Now, ready to fly into another rage, he listened to the children's story. He forgot to drink his cooling tea. He forgot to fill his pipe. He even forgot to ask a single question. Never had he heard such a wonderful, glorious tale in his life. Julian told the story well, and the others filled in any bits he left out. Mrs. Philpot's eyes almost fell out of her head when she heard how Snippet and Nosy had gone into the rabbit burrow and come out with a broken sword and a ring. But where did she began, and listened again to hear how Dick and Julian had enlarged the burrow, crawled right through it, and slid down into the long-lost secret tunnel. "Ha!" said Great-Grandad, getting out his great red handkerchief and dabbing his forehead with it. "Ha! Wish I'd been there. Go on, go on." Julian had stopped to drink his tea. He laughed and went on describing how they had all gone up the tunnel with their torches, the dogs with them. "It was dark and smelly, and suddenly we heard a terrific noise," he said. "It got right inside our heads," put in Anne. "What was it? What was it?" said Great-Grandad, his eyes almost as big as the saucer in front of him. "The noise of the men drilling up on the old castle site," said Julian, and Great-Grandad exploded in wrath. He pointed his pipe at his grandson, the farmer. "Didn't I tell you I wouldn't have those men on my farm?" he began, and then calmed down as Mrs. Philpot patted his arm, shushing him. "Go on, Julian," she said. And then came the really exciting part, the story of how they came into the actual cellars of the castle, the stone archways, the age-old dust, and the echoes, said Anne. When we whispered, 100 other whispers came back. When Julian described their finds, the old armour still good but black with age, the rack of swords and knives and daggers, the chest of gold. "Gold! I don't believe you," shouted Great-Grandad. "You're making that up, young man. Don't you pile up your table too much now. Stick to the truth." The twins promptly took out some of the gold coins out of their pockets, still brilliant and shining. They laid them on the table in front of the 3 amazed grown-ups. "There you are. They will tell you if we were making this up or not. These gold coins, they will speak more loudly than words." In awe, Mr. Philpot picked them up and passed them one by one to the old man and to his wife. Great-Grandad was dumbfounded and dumbstruck. He simply could not say a single word. He could only grunt and puff as he turned the coins over in his great horny hand. "Are they really gold?" said Mrs. Philpot, quite overcome at the sudden appearance of the shiny coins. "Trevor, will they belong to us? Does it mean that we'll be well enough to buy a new tractor for you and—" "Depends how much of this stuff there is up in those old cellars," said Mr. Philpot, trying to keep calm. "And depends on how much we're allowed to keep, of course. Might belong to the Crown by now." "The Crown?" roared Great-Grandad, standing up suddenly. "The Crown? No, sir. It's mine, ours, found on my land, put there by our ancestors. Yes, and I'll give old Mr. Finniston down in the village a share, so I will. He's been a good friend of mine for years." The children thought that was quite a good idea. They then showed the jewellery that they had brought, and Mrs. Philpot marvelled at it, tarnished though it was. But the swords and daggers brought the greatest excitement to old Great-Grandad and his grandson, Mr. Philpot. As soon as they heard that the children had actually brought back some of the old weapons, the 2 men got up and went to get them. Great-Grandad picked up the biggest and heaviest of the swords and swung it dangerously round his head, looking like a reincarnation of some fearsome old warrior with his great beard and blazing eyes. "No, no, Grandad," said Mrs. Philpot in fright. "Oh, you'll knock down the things on the dresser. There, I knew you would. Bang goes my meat dish." And down it went, crash. Timmy and Snippet almost jumped out of their skins and began to bark frantically. "Sit down, all of you," cried Mrs. Philpot to the excited dogs and the men. "Let Julian finish his story. Great-Grandad, sit down." "Ha!" said Great-Grandad, a broad smile on his face, sitting down in his chair. "Ha! Did me a good swing, that sword. Where's that American? I might try it out on him." The children roared with delight. It was great to see the old man so delighted. "Go on with that tale of yours," he said to Julian. "You tell it well, boy. Go on. Now, Ma, don't you take my sword away. I'm keeping it here atween my legs in case I want to use it. Ha!" Julian quickly finished his tale and told how they had walked back down the passage and found their burrow entrance fallen in, and then gone right down the rest of the tunnel and come at last to the little stone-walled room. "And we couldn't get out," said Julian. "There was a great wooden trap-door over our heads, and on it lay a dozen or so sacks, heavy as lead. We couldn't lift it, so we yelled." "And that's where the secret passage led to," said Mr. Philpot. "How did you get out?" "We yelled and hammered, and Bill and Jamie heard us and pulled off the sacks and lifted up the old trap-door," said Julian. "Gosh, were we glad to see them. We thought we might be lost forever. Jamie knew about the little stone vault down under the chapel floor, but he thought it was just an old storeroom." "I've never heard of it before," said Mrs. Philpot, and old great-granddad nodded his head in agreement. "No more have I," he said. "For as long as I can remember, the floor of that old chapel has been piled with sacks, and what bits I could see of the floor was covered with thick dust. Yes, even when I was a boy playing hide-and-seek in the old place, it was full of sacks, and that's every bit of 85 years ago now. Well, well, seems like yesterday I was playing in there with a cat and her kittens." "There's a cat and her kittens there now," said Anne. "Aye, little lass, there'll be a cat and her kittens there when you're an old, old woman," said Great-Grandad. "There's some things never change, thanks be to the Lord. Well, well, I can sleep easy of nights now. I reckon you and the farm will be all right, Trevor, with the money you'll make out of those old finds, and I'll live to see the twins growing up and handling the finest farm in Dorset, so I shall, with everything new-fangled they want, bless their bonny faces. And now I'll just have one more swing with that sword." The children fled. Great-Grandad looked years younger already, and goodness knows what damage he would do with that great old sword. What an afternoon it had been, one they would never forget.